How to say what is that? How to say what is that? Engu enamo. Engu enamo. What is that? Engu enamo. How to say that is a pencil? How to say that is a pencil? Namo egalam jat. Namo egalam jat. How to say what is this? How to say what is this? Neme engu. Neme engu. What is this? Neme engu. How to say this is a pencil? Neme egalam jat. This is a pencil. Neme egalam jat. How to say what are these? How to say what are these? Tete kanguni. Tete kanguni. Tete kanguni. How to say these are papers? These are papers. Ken kewargani. Ken kewargani. We can put it tete kewargani. These are papers. Tete kewargani. How to say what do you want? How to say what do you want? Engu gorimo. Engu gorimo. What do you want? Engu gorimo. How to say I want a cup of tea? How to say I want a cup of tea? En gore gubai shaker. En gore gubai shaker. How to say what does he like? How to say what does he like? Jen engu nokomo. Jen engu nokomo. He molodlode ni wut ketut. Jen engu nokomo. What does he like? How to say he likes coffee? How to say he likes coffee? Jen nokanibun. Jen nokanibun. How to say what is your name? How to say what is your name? Shwalke shudu idi. Shwalke shudu idi. How to say what is your name? Shwalke shudu idi. How to say my name is Gadwich? How to say my name is Gadwich? Shwalke shuda Gadwich. Shwalke shuda Gadwich. How to say which bag is yours? How to say which bag is yours? A bag Indian ladungdumo. A bag Indian ladungdumo. How to say which bag is yours? A bag Indian ladungdumo. How to say the red one is mine? How to say the red one is mine? Minder ejendungda. Minder ejendungda. The red one is mine. How to say which pencil is his? How to say which pencil is his? Rashaj Indian ladungdamo. Rashaj Indian ladungdamo. Rashaj Indian ladungdamo. Which pencil is his? Rashaj Indian ladungdamo. How to say the long one? How to say the long one? Min barijan. Min barijan. How to say when will you come? When will you come? How to say when will you come? Bibenine. Bibenine. How to say when will you come? Bibenine. How to say I will come today? How to say I will come today? Bebenen wale. Bebenen wale. How to say when does he go? How to say when does he go? Bawene. Bawene. When does he go? Bawene. How to say he will go this afternoon? How to say he will go this afternoon? Bawe kajan shang derame. Bawe kajan shang derame. He will go this afternoon. Bawe kajan shang derame. How to say where is your pencil? How to say where is your pencil? Rashaj ke galam du jani. Rashaj du jani. where is your pencil? Rachai du jani, or where is your pen? Galam du jani. How to say my pencil is here? My pencil is here. Rachaj ke galam de jana gwasame. Rachai de jana gwasame. Rachai de jana gwasame. How to say where does he live? How to say where does he live? Shenga Gwasendian. Shenga Gwasendian. Where does he live? Shenga Gwasendian. How to say he lives with his family? How to say he lives with his family? Jen Shenga Kel Kene Jedware. Jen Shenga Kel Kene Jedware. How to say he lives with his family? Jen Shenga Kel Kene Jedware. How to say who is this man? How to say who is this man? Ajenga en wuteme. How to say who is this man? Ajenga en wuteme. Ajenga en wuteme. He is Misorgatluak. He is Misorgatluak. Ajen Misorgatluak. Ajen Misorgatluak. How to say who is he? Who is he? How to say who is he? Jen anga. Jen anga. How to say he is our teacher? He is our teacher. Ajen ngidan. Ajen ngida or ajen ngidan. How to say he is our teacher? Ajen ngidan. How to say whom do you meet? How to say whom do you meet? Anga biarumo. Anga biarumo. Whom do you meet? Anga biarumo. How to say whom does he know? How to say whom does he know? Ngechanga. Ngechanga. How to say whom does he know? Ngechanga. How to say whom do you like? How to say whom do you like? Nokininga. Nokininga. How to say whom do you like? Nokininga. Nokininga. Well, how to say whose pencil is this? Whose pencil is this? Angate karashasheme. Angate karashasheme. Whose pencil is this? Angate karashasheme. How to say whose books are those? Whose book are those? Angate kabongnititi. Angate kabongnititi. How to say why did you come here? How to say why did you come here? Angu bekeji and gwaseme. Angu bekeji and gwaseme. How to say why is he late? How to say why is he late? Angu mlajenkeje. Angu mlajenkeje. Why is he late? Angu mlajenkeje. How to say how is life? How to say how is life? Take teddy or take weighty. How is life? Take teddy or you can use take weighty. How to say how old are you? How old are you? How to say how old are you? Jinti karundangdi. Jinti karundangdi. How to say how old are you? Jinti karundangdi. How to say how much money does he have? How much money does he have? How to say how much money does he have? Jen kayudi take jeto. Or you can just simply say Jen take yudi. Jen kayudi take jeto. How much money does he have? How to say how many brothers does he have? How to say how many brothers does he have? Jen take the money dangdi. Jen take the money dangdi. Please make sure you subscribe. Support the channel by subscribing and do not forget to share it with others. Thank you. Let's meet on the next lesson.